Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar series, Challenges of Expanding Access to Health Products in Fight Against Neglected Tropical Diseases. This webinar is organized by Japan Alliance on Global Neglected Tropical Diseases, JAGntd, and sponsored by Global Health Innovative Technology Fund, JHIT Fund. My name is Kota Yoshioka, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Tropical Medicine, Nagasaki University. It's my pleasure to have you all for today's session. And this webinar series is designed to discuss key access challenges in the field of NTDs. In the previous session, we talked about how to make pharmaceutical companies more concerned about access to medicines in low and middle income countries. And we explored the influence and the potential of the Access to Medicine Index. Okay, now let me see what my co-moderator found interesting during the previous session. Isaac, please come in and please introduce yourself and share one takeaway from the previous session.
Thank you very much, Yoshoka-san. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Isaac Chikwana. I'm the Senior Director for Access and Delivery at the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund, JHIT Fund. So from the last session on access to medicine, the take-home message for me was, it was very interesting to see that the top Japanese companies on the Access to Medicine Index in the top 20 are also some of the founding partners for JHIT. So, but what's more interesting is that some of these companies actually do not have specific products for neglected tropical diseases, but just being engaged or funding JHIT, it shows their commitment to global health, and also by trying to have access considerations as a core value for the companies, it also shows their investment in access to health. So I hope that for me, that was really encouraging, and I hope it's also encouraging and motivating to other companies that even without a product specifically targeting neglected tropical diseases, they could still contribute to global health by having the necessary access considerations for their own products, or by investing in entities like JHIT that support other companies that have neglected tropical disease products in their portfolio. So for me, that was an interesting takeaway point. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Isaac. Yeah, the last session was very encouraging for us. That's right, thank you. And let me call Nishimura-san. Please join us.
Hello, I'm Taro Nishimura, and I'm a Master's of Public Health student working for JAGntd. And last session, I think it was about the push incentive that encourages the research and development of NTD drug. And it was really interesting to learn about the current efforts on R&D in the 4 major pharmaceutical companies in Japan, and how this ranking system by the AMF, the Access to Medicine Index, was fitting well with the Japanese culture, which values honor and reward. And that was really interesting. And this session will focus on the pull incentive that drives the delivery and dissemination of the already patented drug. So I'm looking forward to comparing the 2 different approaches to nudge this industry. Thank you.
Great insight. Yeah, changing the industry culture is something very important. And my takeaway. So I would emphasize the power of investors over pharmaceutical companies. But I think this investors' power has not been used yet, as better scores in the Access to Medicine Index does not come together with better price in the stock market. And we need to think how to leverage this investors' hidden power to improve access to medicine. Great. So after discussing and remembering key topics from the previous session. Now let's move on to today's topic. We talk about patent in today's session, and we'll keep talking about how to nudge the pharmaceutical industry. So in today's session, we explore the role of patents in access to medicines. As you know, as we all know, this is a hot topic in global health. There was a worldwide call or campaign for a patent waiver on COVID vaccines. Some argued that waiving patents can improve significantly access to vaccines in low and middle income countries. But others said that patent waiver does not work, does no more than harm to the industry. And this debate shows that people see patents as a critical factor in expanding access to a certain health product. But there's a question. Is waiving the only thing that we can do with patents? Now, I am very delighted to invite today's speaker, Esteban Brone from the Medicines Patent Pool, or MPP. MPP aims to expand access to medicines in low and middle income countries. MPP uses patent pooling as a mechanism to improve access. Esteban will explain how this mechanism works. At this moment, MPP does not include NTD medicines in its portfolio, but we would like to discuss whether we can apply this patent pooling to NTD's product. So, over to you, Esteban.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and have the opportunity to share some thoughts. Let me share my slides. So what I intend to do during this session is really dive into one mechanism that's developed over the last 11 to 12 years to manage intellectual property rights to support public health objectives. It's the experience of the Medicines Patent Pool. I'll walk you through that in the following structure. So initially, I want to introduce to you the Medicines Patent Pool as an organization and give you a sense of who we are, what we do, how we operate, some of the successes, perhaps some of the challenges as well. I'll then move on to talking about a couple of case studies, which I think are a good way for diving into the practicalities of how we work. And I'll focus on a couple of medicines. One is an HIV medicine called dolutegravir, and the second one is some of the antivirals for COVID-19, which I know is probably a very topical issue at the current moment. But finally, what I think might be also interest to this audience is to try and see how this kind of model potentially could be applied also to neglected tropical diseases, bearing in mind some of the challenges that are likely to be there, but also perhaps some of the opportunities that may arise. So that is really the fourth section, one that I would like to really open it up then for the discussion with the audience, because of course you are all greater experts in neglected tropical diseases than I am, but I can bring you a perspective from the experience of our work in facilitating access. So let me start with the Medicines Patent Pool and explaining to you a little bit about our organization. And the Medicines Patent Pool is a public health organization established back in 2010. So we have been operational now for almost 12 years. And the objective initially was really twofold. Firstly, accelerate access to new HIV medicines. So there were a wave of new HIV medicines that looked particularly important for treatment in low and middle income countries. And there were concerns from public health organizations that it may be difficult to access them at affordable prices in low and middle income countries. These were, of course, the countries with the highest burden of disease, particularly, for example, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But they were also countries that were not perceived to be of high commercial interest to the pharmaceutical industry. So it really seemed like there was an opportunity there to find a bridging between the needs on the ground, but the lack of commercial returns or commercial interest in view of the limited ability to pay in many of these countries. The second objective was to facilitate the development of new formulations that were needed in developing countries. These are, for example, pediatric HIV medicines, which is, pediatric HIV is essentially a disease that's primarily prevalent in developing countries, and most importantly in sub-Saharan Africa and a few other countries outside of Africa. Another example is new fixed dose combinations. So combinations of more than one HIV medicine that can be brought together into a single pill. That too is an area where, through the work of the MPP, we can facilitate. How do we do that? Essentially what we do is we negotiate voluntary licenses. So this is licensing agreements with the pharmaceutical industry, with the innovators, with those that hold the patents on these new medicines, and then subsequently licensing that out to manufacturers based primarily in low and middle income countries that are then supplying those countries with the medicine. So I'll get into a little bit more detail on how that works in a minute. But just to say, our initial mandate was HIV. Over time, we expanded into hepatitis C and tuberculosis. And that worked out very well as well. That was after we had some successes in HIV that we gradually expanded. Subsequently, the World Health Organization called on us to explore working in relation to any other patented essential medicines. So medicines that are on the WHO essential medicines list, or that have strong potential for inclusion in that essential medicines list. And potentially this could apply also to neglected tropical diseases. It's true that we have so far not had licenses on neglected tropical diseases, unless we consider tuberculosis to be in that category. However, we could, if there was a need, potentially operate and apply our model in neglected tropical diseases. And finally, expanded our mandate into COVID-19 in the year 2020, and that was partly supported by the Japanese government. And I take the opportunity to thank the Japanese government for that support. So the MPP model, how we work. We start by identifying those medicines that are particularly needed in low and middle income countries, those that can provide a significant health value, health impact. And we do that by working very closely together with the World Health Organization and some other stakeholders. The second step is approaching the patent holders, those that own those medicines, to explore the possibility of licensing. But licensing with the objective of achieving public health objectives. Because we are a non-profit organization, our objective is not to maximize shareholder value, but to maximize public health. And that's the perspective from which we seek to negotiate licenses. But we are fully aware that our partners are industrial partners, and so it has to be a win-win. It has to be an agreement that works for all the parties, so also works for the industry that we're partnering with, both on the innovator side, but also on the generic side. Because once we have a license, we give it out so we publish that license, and we call on generic manufacturers to apply for a sub-license. And these generic manufacturers, those that are really committed to making the drug available in developing countries, that have proven capacity and proven track record are then selected, and we work with those manufacturers to accelerate the development of the product, where needed to adapt the product for formulations that are needed in developing countries. And finally, and most important, then work with public health agencies, governments, patient groups, and civil society to support the availability, affordability, and uptake in low and middle income countries. This is another perspective on how we operate, where you can see the licensing in from the innovators, the manufacturers on the other side, eventually supplying the drug, and some of the guiding principles that guide our work. Public health driven, that's our objective. We focus on accelerating access, but also facilitating certain type of innovation. We provide non-exclusive licenses so that there is competition among several manufacturers, and that contributes to keeping the prices affordable, which is a key objective. Our licenses are transparent, they are voluntary, so we work with the industry to find an agreement that works for all sides. Quality is essential. We're very, very keen on ensuring that the products that are developed through our licenses meet high quality standards. And here is an overview of the companies that we have worked with, the companies and universities from which we have obtained licenses. And I'm sure you'll recognize many of the big players, large pharmaceutical companies, but also some smaller companies and some universities. I would also mention that a couple of the products for which we have licenses, while they are being licensed to the MPP by American or British companies, the initial compounds had been discovered and patented and developed by Japanese companies. And one example is dolutegravir, which is originally a Shionogi drug that was then finally developed through ViiV Healthcare, which is the company that gave us a license. And also elvitegravir. Elvitegravir is a drug originally developed by Japan Tobacco, or initially discovered by Japan Tobacco. So both have an origin in Japan. In terms of impact of our work, so we recently published this paper in the Lancet Public Health, because we really wanted to make sure we could try and understand what's the result of all this licensing work. Because a license, as you know, is just a piece of paper. That's not going to solve any problem. What we want to know is that resulting in people getting the drugs they need? And is that saving lives? And so this is what we try to do with this paper. So we really looked at both the economics, the cost savings from the licenses MPP negotiated already, focusing on those for HIV and hepatitis C. We could see that we already have almost $1 billion in savings through the procurement of more affordable treatments. And this is projected to reach $3.5 billion only on the basis of those that for which we already have licenses. But perhaps more importantly, by 2030, we expect that the work that we've done together with many other stakeholders, because I want to stress that this is not the impact of the MPP alone. This is the impact of MPP's licenses with innovators, with the generic manufacturers making the drugs, with procurement agencies procuring them, with civil society groups calling for the demand for these medicines to be made accessible, governments buying them, treatment programs introducing them, people taking those medicines, etc., etc. So it's really a team effort of many, many different stakeholders. So let me start with one of the case studies I wanted to talk about. This is dolutegravir. Now, just to give you a little bit of a context for this, this is a medicine that we estimate approximately 20 million people are accessing today in low and middle income countries. What's interesting about this is that the initial medicine, as I said, was discovered by Shionogi, subsequently licensed to ViiV Healthcare, and we had a license with ViiV back in 2014. At that time, it looked like a very promising new medicine. In low and middle income countries, WHO indicated that what was really needed was not just affordable versions of dolutegravir, but affordable versions of a new combination that would include dolutegravir. And this is the TLD combination, which is a combination of tenofovir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir. So it was our generic licensees that first developed that combination and got approval back in 2017. And then 2018, this became the preferred first-line treatment for HIV by the WHO, and over time has become the preferred first-line treatment in a large number of low and middle income countries. This is the range of countries that have already accessed dolutegravir or the combination TLD from our licensees. This data dates back from end 2020, so that's probably evolved further during 2021. But you see a large number of medicines supplied and almost 20 million people accessing that product or that combination. So this is a real success story of working not just on facilitating access to a groundbreaking new treatment, but also facilitating and enabling innovation that enables that drug to become the preferred treatment today and being widely taken up. Now, briefly to get into some of the COVID-19 treatments that are more recent area for MPP to work on. So we have licenses on two antivirals. One developed by Merck, the pharmaceutical company Merck, called molnupiravir, and one by Pfizer, which is nirmatrelvir, which is combined with ritonavir, and more generally known as Paxlovid, which is the brand name of the Pfizer product. So we have licenses on both these products that were announced back in October and November 2021. The licenses allow MPP to grant sub-licenses to manufacturers anywhere in the world. Of course, we do a very thorough assessment of manufacturers that qualify and have the capacity and knowledge to do this and the commitment. It includes licenses on the patents, but it also includes the transfer of confidential know-how, of technology pack that facilitates and helps the manufacturers to rapidly develop that product. Of course, that's only for those manufacturers that need that. Some of them have indicated they will not be requiring the tech pack. They will be developing the generic version on their own, supported by the license, but without requiring the know-how. In the case of these two drugs, these are royalty-free during the WHO public health emergency of international concern. I would say that not all our licenses are royalty-free. Some of them have royalties. And in fact, in these two licenses, there will also be royalties after the WHO declares the end of the WHO public health emergency of international concern. But for the time being, they are royalty-free. The licensees can supply 105 in the case of the Merck license, or 95 countries in the case of the Pfizer license. And both of these account for approximately 4.1 billion people. So these are countries home to 53% of the world population, which is significant. In both cases, we require that the licensees need to have approval from the WHO pre-qualification program to ensure quality, or from a stringent regulatory authority. The licensee has the right to terminate the license if it no longer needs it, and the licenses are fully transparent on the MPP website. This is the territory of the molnupiravir license, so the countries that are listed in the license as being able to, as included. And this is the announcement we did just a few weeks back of the licensees that will be working with us to make this product available. This is a large number of licensees, more than what we usually have had. But this is partly been because of the strong calls to support and improve local production of medicines, given the critical problems that many countries faced during the COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore calls for improving capacity from local and regional manufacturers to supply medicines of need. So let's come briefly to the neglected tropical diseases and see what it is and to what extent could our model be applied in these cases. Would it work? What's different? And what could be the challenges? So I wanted to first list some of the things that I see as potentially different or challenging in the field of neglected tropical diseases. But of course, I'd like to hear from you, as you are probably more of an expert than I am in this area. The first point I'd like to flag is that there is generally a lack of commercially attractive markets to recover research and development costs. One of the reasons why these diseases are seen as neglected is because there is not enough R&D investment, research and development investment. In our other areas like HIV or COVID, there was a strong incentive to develop products because there is a very lucrative commercial market in the high-income countries. And so pharmaceutical companies recover their costs of research and development through their sales in those countries and enable generics to come in for the supply of low and middle income countries. That may work very differently here, where you do not have those commercially attractive high-income markets. Secondly, neglected tropical disease technologies are often not patent protected. That's not always the case, I would like to stress. But it is true that at times there may not be, for the reasons I mentioned, lack of commercially attractive markets, there may be less patenting taking place in relation to NTD health technologies, partly because they're sometimes being developed by product development partnerships or public health organizations that may not be interested in patenting. But this is, of course, not always the case, and there are many instances in which there are patents. Thirdly, small markets may make it insufficiently attractive to generic manufacturers. I would think that you wouldn't see 27 manufacturers interested in really getting a license. In fact, for the COVID medicines, we had applications for over 100 generic manufacturers interested in making them, and that clearly wouldn't be the case here. There's no or much more limited donor funding than there has been in some other areas like HIV. And targeted product donations from pharmaceutical companies often play a very important role for several NTD products. And therefore, the model we're working on is quite different. It's not based on donations. Now, let me turn that around and try and see what are some of the opportunities and the potential that could be here. Firstly, the licensing doesn't have to apply necessarily to patented products. Increasingly, the focus of our work is also on the transfer of know-how, of clinical data, of technology, biological material, to facilitate product development and reduce costs. So even in those cases where they may not be patents, licensing may be instrumental to facilitate the development and of the product by other manufacturers. Secondly, many neglected tropical disease products are being developed with funding from philanthropies or from governments, and there may be more limited expectations of recovering the full costs of research and development. So those who have developed may not need for the drug to be a blockbuster in high-income countries in order to enable it to make it available through licensing in developing countries. Thirdly, once developed, There is a need to identify manufacturers who are going to be committed to long-term supply and focus on achieving public health objectives. So often the products are being developed by organizations that are experts in developing new products. But that does not mean that they are experts in manufacturing them or that they are willing to take a long-term commitment to supply those products. And I think that's where licensing can play a critical role, to identify the right manufacturers and to really bring them in and support them. Of course, this would be a smaller number of licensees. And that will depend, of course, on the size of the market. And the fourth point I'd like to note is we really need to identify sustainable models for NTD access in the long term. Targeted product donations can play a role in very specific circumstances, but should be short-term solutions. They really don't provide a sustainable access model, which is what we would really like to see here. So how could MPP's experience or MPP's licensing experience be applied here? And how could it be leveraged in the field of neglected tropical diseases? One thing that we have a track record on is experience in identifying manufacturers that are committed to working with us to supply low and middle income countries. And not just identifying those manufacturers, but working very closely with them. We have a license management mechanism that is highly sophisticated, because it's not just about working with the company, but it's about working with all those public health stakeholders to accelerate in-country access so that the product actually becomes available on the ground. So that's what we can bring to the table, not just the ability to identify manufacturers and work with them, but also to work with the public health stakeholders. And because we have licenses on multiple products, some of them may be very attractive, I wonder whether one could leverage that, leverage the possibility of licenses on some perhaps more attractive or commercially attractive products, but to leverage that to get commitments from the manufacturers to also make those NTD products for which the markets may be smaller. And we're also now increasingly developing our own capacity to support through technology transfer. We're developing a technology transfer work stream within the Medicines Patent Pool, which could also contribute to supporting manufacturers to accelerate development, to lower the cost of development, and to improve their capacity to deliver to public health needs. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope that that's provided a bit of food for thought in terms of what we do, how we've been operating until now, and potentially some of the challenges in neglected tropical diseases that we may face, but also some of the opportunities that may be there. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my slides. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Esteban. I think your slides included lots of very important implications for us. Okay, so Isaac-san, let's start discussing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Esteban, for that presentation. I have many questions, but I think you also provided some of the answers already in your slides. But I just wanted to zoom in on some specific points, and it's also some of the questions that are being asked by the audience. So let me just start with one question from the audience before I go to my own questions. So you sort of alluded to this a little bit in your presentation, but one of the participants is asking, why is there a criteria why you chose HIV, Hep C, TB, and COVID to start with? But I think you mentioned it a little bit. I just wanted you to maybe elaborate a little bit more. And I think it's also one of the discussions we've had with you, why or how can the same model be applied to NTDs, and you have sort of answered that a bit already. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Isaac. So I think what we were trying to do back in 2010 when we started this project was quite a new approach. It hadn't been done before. And so we needed to test it out in one area to see whether that model could work. And HIV was the ideal candidate because there were a number of new medicines that had been developed that were on the WHO essential medicines list, that were protected by patents, and where there were concerns about affordable access in some of the countries with the highest burden of disease. And so it provided the ideal opportunity to see whether we could make this work. And so that's why we started with HIV. As the model became successful and we managed to get a number of important licenses and access to these products started to increase, and a few new products were developed for hepatitis C and for tuberculosis that were also added to the essential medicines list of WHO. And so at that point, UNITAID, who was our funder at the time and remains one of our key funders, identified as a critical area where MPP potentially could also support. So that's why we expanded there. At some point, the WHO made it very clear that ideally, it makes sense for MPP not to be necessarily focused on a disease, but the mechanism could be applied more broadly wherever there is an important medicine. Initially was just about medicine that could really meet public health needs in developing countries, and where there were access problems and there were patents on it, or the need for the licenses, and licenses could either accelerate innovation or access, then why not have the MPP play a role? And we went through a long process of assessment of what would it mean for MPP to start working, for example, in relation to some non-communicable diseases. And it turned out through that analysis that there was a lot of opportunities there. Of course, there are also challenges, but we really thought that there was a strong need for improving access to new medicines in non-communicable diseases as well. And as we progress, other initiatives or other opportunities arise. And with COVID, it became critical, essentially at the request of the World Health Organization, our board said, do whatever you can to support the WHO. If they need you, please go ahead. And that's where our mandate really in COVID-19 got expanded into other areas that we're doing some work on diagnostics and some work around vaccines. Particularly, we're working very closely with the WHO on the mRNA technology transfer hub in South Africa. And that's a very big project and new for us. And so this is really trying to see how the expertise we have can best be applied to different circumstances. And it does require adaptation. So I do not expect that us working on health technology for neglected tropical disease would go exactly the same way as it did for HIV, for COVID, or for cancer. We need to be able to adapt it as appropriate. And that's what I'm interested in hearing also from participants here. Where do you see the problems or the challenges, but also where do you see the opportunities? Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And I think Yoshoka-san actually has a question linked to this. So I'll give the floor to Yoshoka-san for your question.
Okay, yeah, let me begin with a bit silly or a basic question. What is the difference between a patent waiver and a patent pooling that you apply in MPP?
A patent waiver is meant to be, is being proposed as a situation in which there wouldn't be for the duration of the pandemic or the public health emergency, for example, there would be no patents on a given product or on any product. The way it's been proposed on any health technology for COVID-19. And of course, there's different views, and some people could apply just to vaccines, etc. But broadly speaking, a situation in which you wouldn't have patents. So the international treaty, in particular the TRIPS agreement, that provides the minimum standards for patent protection that countries apply in their national laws, would be waived. Therefore, countries not needing under the WTO agreements, like the TRIPS agreement, to ensure patent protection. Now, what we do is quite different, because the way we operate is, regardless of, essentially we work on products that have patent protection primarily. So it's situations, it's about the management of those rights. It's about the management of the intellectual property rights and the patents. So of course, what does a patent do? A patent provides the patent owner the right to exclude others from making that invention. That's the fundamental definition of a patent. It's the exclusive right for 20 years to exclude others, to stop others from making that invention. And that is meant to incentivize innovation. It's meant to give you the possibility, to develop, to invest in innovation, because you have a promise of returns thanks to that exclusivity. But that does not mean that the patent holder has to stop others or exclude others from making that invention. It can decide to enable others and even facilitate it by giving them know-how or giving them technology or giving them support. And therefore, that's why I say this is about the management, because the innovator, the patent holder, has the patents, but decides to exercise that right in a different way, not necessarily by stopping others from making the invention, which is what they have the right to do under the patent law, but to in fact enable others to make it, and indeed at times support them and facilitate that development, so that the product, the generic product, can be made more rapidly at the right quality standards, etc., etc. So that's what we do. We work within the patent system as is, and within and with the industry that has both those who have developed the product, but also those who will be manufacturing, the licensees.
Thank you. Before you continue, Shoka-san, I just wanted to thank you very much for that point, Esteban, because I think that really nails it about the use of patents. I think that there's a general misconception about patents. Some view them as a barrier. For us as for JAGnt, because we fund innovations, we actually view them as an incentive for innovation, as you have said. But I think we also have situations where they have been misused or abused. But I think what you mentioned there is that they can be managed appropriately to enable an impact on global health. So I really wanted to thank you for making that point. Yeah. Yoshoka-san, to continue with your question.
Okay, great. So let's talk about NTDs, how we can apply this model to NTDs. I think there are a couple of key assumptions for this model to work well. The first one is we need to have our manufacturer or innovator, original patent holders, that is willing to share their patent with others. The second one is that there should be generic manufacturers in low and middle income countries that are willing to take the sub-licenses and make and sell these generic drugs. And the third one is there should be a demand from the patient side and user side. So keeping in mind these three assumptions, which NTDs or which NTD product or product candidate may fit well into this model? And this is a question to Isaac too, maybe.
So thank you very much, Yoshoka-san. But so I think without really going into any specific product per se, I think Esteban has mentioned the specificities of the NTD market, that the market dynamics are a little bit different. And one of them is this issue of not having a lucrative market. And this is something we see at JAGnt. We find NTD products, and this question always comes up, because there's no market. And in some cases, I'm assuming even having, the voluntary licensing might not even be attractive to the generic manufacturers themselves, because they won't make anything out of it. So the question is, how can we use the licenses to the benefit of the inventors or the innovators? And this is actually linked to a question. I can add a question to your question, and then I pass it on to Esteban. So how can we make the MPP model attractive for NTDs? So, and I just wanted to zoom in on the question of PRVs. Do you see this as an incentive? And I think you mentioned it a little bit in your presentation that the licenses could be used for something else. So I just wanted to zoom in on the PRV with priority review vouchers. Do you see this as a potential angle where NTD innovators might not benefit from their product itself, but could use the license? For example, if they get a PRV, if they qualify for a PRV, and then they can use it to fund something else, and then they can make the money, or if it's about money, on that side. Could this be an angle that could be interesting? Because the market dynamics themselves might not be lucrative even for MPP to consider.
Yeah. No, I think these are good questions, and certainly I don't think there's no easy answer or solution to the challenges in the NTD markets. I don't think that all of a sudden, if MPP starts working hard in the NTD markets, that's going to solve the problems. I think there are significantly underlying challenges which are there, and a lot of the great work JAGntd and its partners are doing are trying to overcome some of those. And one of the biggest problems in my mind is you have very high needs, but those needs are not translated into demand, into market demand, because of a lack of capacity to pay by those who have where the needs are the regions or the parts of the world where the needs are particularly high. Your point about the priority review vouchers, I think, is interesting, because that speaks to trying to create incentives for the research and development to take place. And so if that can help to have pharmaceutical companies with the greatest R&D capacity to devote some of that capacity to the development of new NTD products, that's great. That plays an important role. The question then becomes, are these companies likely going to want to commit to long-term access to that product, knowing their high costs of manufacturing faced by these companies and the high operational costs that are faced by these companies? The whole reason why our model works is because the generic manufacturers that are working with us are not facing the high R&D costs and have much lower production costs. And that's why they can, and they have, of course, great scientific capacity to bring the products and compete among themselves to make them more and more affordable. So they have that capacity, and we can exploit that. So if we have the incentives, which could be things like the priority review voucher, but also funding from organizations like JAGntd that contribute to developing these new products. So you have products that are looking promising and important, but what you're needing is those manufacturers that can make them much cheaper and that can commit to long-term access, but in a sustainable way, because no company that gets into donations wants to stay there for long. They're immediately looking for an exit strategy after a while. And that's the problem we need to face. Now, you still need some level of demand. You still need some level of market to operate. So if nobody's going to buy the product at the end, you will always have that problem. But I think that if we need to be thinking, it's not something that can happen immediately, but we need to get beyond a product donation model into a model that provides sustainable returns to all concerned, but in the most efficient way possible. So get the best possible organizations involved in R&D, thanks to the PRV or JAGntd and others. And that's great. And the product development partnerships work, etc., in the industry. But then get the most efficient, low-cost, quality manufacturing that you can get through the type of partners that we work with. And we can be that bridge that makes that happen and can work with the public health organizations. But ultimately, you will still need a buyer, and you still need to incentivize the uptake. And that will remain a challenge, but it may be, depending how you're defining NTDs, may be easier in some areas where you already have some buyers and some markets, like tuberculosis, like malaria, etc. But over time, hopefully, there can be also sustainable markets in other diseases.
Indeed, thank you. So for NTDs, I mean, you've really said it's not just about the licensing. There is a lot more that needs to be researched and done to really make that win-win situation possible. And it's very interesting that you mentioned this win-win. Again, when you talk to people about patents and the MPP, some people always see it as the MPPs getting the license, and it's only the generic manufacturers that are winning, but the innovator is not winning. But you really emphasize this concept that it is a win-win situation. You try to negotiate the best for the innovator, and you also try to to negotiate the best for public health impact. And one of the things that you mentioned is the issue of royalties. So my question is that a standard operating procedure that you get royalties, or it's case-by-case basis, and how does it work with the royalties?
Yeah. So perhaps just one thing to clarify on what we're saying. We're not negotiating hard for the industry. The industry does that when they negotiate with us. Our objective is public health. But of course, we are partnering and negotiating with another organization that has to care for its own objectives as well. The fact that we reach an agreement and sign it means that both parties willingly got to something that worked for all sides. So, and the industry, the reasons why they may give a license to MPP could be different kinds. I think that royalties can be part of that, but there is a genuine concern from companies, I think, that have developed important products for developing countries on finding models that work and that get the product to people. And of course, they cannot be devoting significant resources to that because those are not commercially profitable enterprises. But they want to make sure that the drug gets there in a way that doesn't affect their commercial markets. And that's what we're there to provide. A track record of delivering, of making the products available in a way that they continue to have commercial returns. They need to be continuing to invest in research and development. Now, in terms of royalties, there's different, there doesn't have to be royalties. And at times, the companies say, we don't want royalties. But royalties is very much on the table during the negotiations. And one thing that we have introduced in some of our licenses is royalties that are different depending on the level of income of the country. So, for example, for any sales in the poorest countries, there may be no royalties. For slightly richer countries, there may be 5% royalties. And for even wealthier countries, it could be 10% or more. So really, it speaks to the issue of equity and speaks to the issue of different countries may be able to pay more, but definitely there are some that may really need to get very access at very low cost. So we have tiered or differentiated the royalties for different countries. I do want to make it clear, though, that those royalties don't come to MPP. They go back to the innovator. Okay, we're being funded by UNITAID and by the governments that I mentioned. But it is one of the incentives to the pharmaceutical industry for potentially providing a license, but certainly not the only one, and probably not the most important one either.
Thank you very much. And this question of profits and licensing keeps popping up. We have another question from the audience about this issue. I'll just read it out directly. So I had some criticism to patent issues as excess profits and lack of transparency. How would you respond to these points through MPP? Like, how would you address, but I think you have mentioned this before, but maybe you specifically address this question. How does MPP address this issue of excessive profits and transparency through licensing?
I mean, excessive profits, I mean, I can't tell. I mean, I think the concerns may be primarily around how, how markets may operate in some of the high income countries or potentially also some low and middle income countries. From the perspective of MPP, I think the companies that are operating and are working with us are not really making profit out of this. And by this, I mean the innovators. The generic manufacturers are not making huge profits either, but they have a sustainable model that they need to make some margins to continue to develop the product. The innovators are not really making much money. I mean, the COVID-19 is a good example. During the public health emergency, no royalties. And essentially what they're doing is they're giving up these markets. They're enabling generics to come in and supply the product. Partly because they don't have the volumes. In COVID-19, they don't have the volumes to supply everybody. And really we need greater manufacturing capacity to ensure we can meet demand. It really depends on different products. In some cases, it could be about enhancing manufacturing capacity. In some cases, it may be about making the product at lower prices, etc. But there could be different ways. In terms of transparency, what I think it's critical, there's 2 points I'd like to make there. The first one is about the patents themselves. Patents are transparent. They're all published. So 18 months after they are filed, I can go and read the full patent. Yeah. Now, in the field of COVID, 18 months might seem a long time because things move fast. But in the usual pharmaceutical world, 18 months means you have access to the full patent information before the drug is approved and on the market. Now, that doesn't mean that all the contracts and procurement, all that hasn't been transparent in COVID. And there's been a lot of concerns about the lack of transparency in the markets, a lot of concerns around the lack of transparency on pricing, etc., and not just in COVID, in many areas. What MPP does is all our licenses are transparent. They're all published in full on our website. And that is unique in the pharmaceutical field. Nobody else really does that. And I think it's something that is important because if the licenses are one of the key things that we're getting, it's important for everybody to know what's in those licenses, what is allowed and what is not allowed. How is this going to contribute to public health outcomes? And so we're very much for transparency. We have a very strong commitment to transparency. And we're really trying, and we hope that contributes to having others also being more transparent, because I think lack of transparency in pharmaceutical markets is a concern for many people, and I can understand why.
Thank you. As we are running out of time, we have one last question and then maybe one last comment. So this is, there's a question from one of the attendees that there seems to be less MPP activity in Latin America from the maps that we're presenting. Why is this so, since this is also your home region?
That's right. I'm from Argentina. And for the example of dolutegravir that I shown, there've been a lot of sales to a large number of Latin American countries that have been able to benefit from that license. But generally speaking, it is true that particularly South America, this is less true for Central America, but most countries in South America are upper middle income countries. And though they're considered by the pharmaceutical industry often to be commercial markets. So while we try and get as many low and middle income countries into our licenses, including upper middle income countries, it's not always easy to do that. So that's really a part of that negotiation to get to a geography of the agreement that enables as many people as possible to benefit. But bearing in mind also that certain areas or certain countries are seen by the industry as highly commercial, where they would prefer to be the ones supplying their own product, and they choose to maintain the exclusivity that the IP system has provided them. So it really depends. I mean, but as I said, in the case of the COVID antivirals, it's 4.1 billion people that potentially could benefit. So that's a lot, and let's try and get that right, because it's already a huge challenge.
Thank you very much, Esteban, for your time. We have run out of time. Before I hand over to Yoshioka-san to close, I just wanted to mention that we really value the role of the MPP. And I think you have shed some light and clarified some issues on what the MPP does, but more on what intellectually IP can do or may be used positively. So I really see MPP as a valuable partner for JHIT, or even directly with other Japanese companies, just to discuss and advise on how best to use patents going forward. So hopefully we can continue those discussions directly as JHIT, or directly with different Japanese manufacturing companies that could be online today, or might see this website, the web recording going forward, because it will be shared publicly, and people will have access to it for some time. Thank you. I hand over to Yoshioka-san.
Great discussion. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Isaac, and thank you, everyone. I think our discussion touched very important things in the field of NTDs. One of them is that the perceived lack of bias. And this point speaks to our next webinar, because in March, we are talking about financing. Who can pay for what? And this is a very challenging topic, but we cannot avoid it when we talk about access. I think Esteban agrees. Thank you. So let's close today's webinar session. See you in March. More details will come on our JAGntd's website, so please check it. So thank you, Stefan, again. Thank you, everyone. And nice to meet you. Let's see again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.